This is GDC Day 5, the final vlog. Now, in terms of talks, I only went to 2. I skipped one because I went to the portfolio review. And I also got a free headshot, which I don't know how that's... I think it's going to be emailed to me, hopefully. But, yeah. The portfolio review went well, by the way. Apparently, it's a good start. I just need to add more information linking back to my GitHub. And I think it seems like I need to be more confident with what projects should go on the portfolio. So that's promising. That's good. I'll get more people to look over it later. But I got in late because my flight kept getting delayed. So I arrived home an hour later than usual, expected. And I have just decompressed a bit, which is why it's so late. But I'm going to cover my closing thoughts after I go over the talks and maybe some other goodies throughout the final day of GDC. So only 2 talks. There is going to be a third. I skipped it to do the portfolio stuff. And the talk is Programming Fundamentals is the first one. Now I did this one mostly as just a check to make sure that my programming understanding is at the most basic level is rock solid of the basics. Because if I don't know much, if there's some big holes in my understanding, that's a problem that needs to be fixed. So this was mostly just kind of an indulgence thing. If you ever gotten a CS degree, you should know most of this. It's arrays, dynamic arrays, hash maps, all that jazz. There are some things I didn't know. There was one thing I didn't know, or rather, didn't think about is more the proper way to think about it. Like, I know hash maps are, and I know what a hashing function is. You use stuff like modulo a number by the length of the array. It's a very common hash function. And the idea is you want to get O of 1 inserts and returns and all that. Great. The thing I didn't think about is that this works best if your hashing function is actually really fast, which is obvious, so obvious that you don't even think about it. But this means that if your hashing function is trying to use strings, for example, and use C++, well, hashing a string is actually O of n, because it's going to sequentially go through each letter and turn that into an ID, into an overarching string. So the result is that if you try to hash your strings, it actually goes much slower than just using an int. Which is something I have never really thought about before. So that was new, and I'm glad I caught that. Otherwise, it's stuff that I have learned, or have learned, excuse me. I've learned either in school or through coding challenges outside of school. Like, for example, how you traverse a how you traverse using breadth first search. The way I was taught it, I believe, was recursive, which is really inefficient. Instead, the best way to do it for both breadth first and depth first search. For breadth first, you just create a queue. You take your child node, the root, consume it, add all of the children to the queue, and then pop them, do what you want to do, add the children, rinse and repeat. This means that because the way it's adding, because queues, for those who don't know, anything you put into it, it's going to come out. The first thing is going to be the last thing to come out. So once you start putting in the children, they're not going to come out yet. So it's only going to worry about the top level stuff. And then all of that has to be dealt with first before we go to the lower bits. Depth first is easy as well. It's just the same setup, but you switch it with a stack. That way it's going to consume everything deep first, because everything it encounters first rather than going wide. But yeah, so it looks like my basic understanding of everything is pretty good, which is great. The second talk I didn't finish because I underestimated, I forgot how long my talk was going to take, and so I said I was going to check out around 4, and it ends at 4:20. I was worried about what would happen if I was very late, so I didn't want to risk it. I just went back. And honestly, I don't think I missed much. It's called Learning from Mistakes. It's a career seminar. It's a bunch of micro talks from people in the industry talking about their experiences, which is cool, but nothing in there so far is anything that I found super, enlightening or mind-blowing. The first one was basically, mini talk was just about, setting believable expectations and not getting too discouraged. And nothing not mind-blowing advice. And the second one was more interesting. It was about, in theory, it's about working abroad, but it's a little thin on the details. Like it will talk about things like, oh, you should know your visas and get that stuff done and put the work to demonstrate that you're willing to understand the culture and barriers and all that jazz. And it's going to be harder for you because people don't want to deal with a lot of paperwork. But otherwise, not particularly interested. And yeah, that's really it on the talks front. I mentioned this already, but I did the portfolio review. That went well. And I went over to Keyword Studios to try to get more information about jobs and job opportunities. I learned a little bit more about them, and specifically that a lot of the jobs they would have, if they were graphics related, would be with Unreal using blueprints and C++, which I do have experience with, some experience with. But I think I need to demonstrate that with a portfolio project or a few, because frankly I also just need to improve my skills in that direction just generally. So that's something I'm gonna try to work on. I spoke actually with an Epic person, about how you should use blueprints, and his response basically is just use them until you can't, essentially. Any situation where you need speed or you need something that blueprints can't describe, that's when you should use C++. Otherwise, just stick to blueprints for basically everything else. Which I think I'm going to take that advice forward and extend it to just a rule for visual scripting in general. Anything you want to prototype quickly, you probably could do very quickly with visual scripting, because it's taking a bunch of blocks that you would have to do by hand, and you would do it really fast. And I intend to do some using a shader graph for something in the future, so I think that's good advice to carry forward for prototyping and purposes. I think it's a good philosophy for thinking about visual scripting. Yeah, that's about it. Oh, wait, one last thing. I went over to the video game. So there's an organization called the Video Game History Foundation. They're a very cool organization. They've been trying to preserve games and game information for a long time, and they've been trying to make a digital library where they scan digital copies of things and preserve it. And I talked to him about my dad and his experience at Monolith and some of the stuff he had. Like, I have this book, this conference book, like a big conference book from one of the first three from GDC 1999, and it contains things like one of my favorite articles in it is a article describing what floats are to an audience that has never really dealt with them before, because in the past no one used floats. You would use fixed point, or you use what was called fixed point, not floating point, which is a very strange, it's much stranger than floats. It's just it's more of a organizational tool for ints, really. It's all still ints, it's just that you're breaking it into two components, and you're imagining the bits in a different way. So it's more informal. It's not, the system doesn't read them as a fixed point. So it's a very strange system. But yeah, he gave me his card in case I ever want to send over stuff to any duplicate stuff over to the archive, or to help get it scanned. I would love to try to see if I can get some of the stuff that my dad got from the past and preserve that. I think that'd be good for the history. I also spoke to the IASTE, International, basically the Hollywood, the coalition of Hollywood guilds, and they are really interested in the entertainer. They're basically the big Hollywood guild. They want to get into games. They want to start unionizing games as well, like with the Game Workers Unite. But if you know anything about unions often have, like any groups of people, political groups, they want to do things in their own way, with their own strategies. Now, both Code to CWA and IATSE, both are affiliate of the AFL-CIO, which are the more dominant union collective. They're not, in more progressive circles, they're not loved because of their own politics and the way they tend to run things and issues that come with, it's kind of inherent to unions in some ways. Like, unions suffer from a problem where they can be kind of easy to corrupt sometimes, like with the longshoremen union or the garbage collectors union in New York, where organized crime took over the union and used it as a front for criminal activity, and just as a way for them to pay their members and launder money. So yeah, that can be a huge problem. And the AFL-CIO also has a pretty racist, explicitly racist history. If you look at the history of how the AFL, because the AFL basically refused black workers to take part in the organization in the 40s, throughout the 30s, 40s, and so on. And the CIO was more tolerant, but when they merged, their promises of, being more tolerant were let's say not complete. But doesn't mean the AFL, but yeah, the AFL-CIO, I've heard some of this stuff before, but it doesn't mean that, I don't know that much. Like, I don't know exactly how the AFL-CIO work, like, criticisms about it in the modern day. The criticisms I described earlier mostly, you could say to conceptually about any union, like, any union, any organization, frankly, is just going to have to deal with corruption and how to prevent it. So that's not really that interesting observation, one. And two, though unions can in some ways be particularly susceptible to it. And the last bit is, I'm not going to say that it's not a problem, but I don't want to start, I don't know, I don't have evidence that it's still a problem in the same way now, or how it's changed. The IWW are the more radical ones, the more radical union collective, but they're not as powerful. IATSE, though, over a century old, so they have been around a while. And the sentiment I got from the booth was like, the way they viewed the CWA is like, you're cute, but like, we know what we're doing. We actually know what we're doing. Let us handle this. Like, that's the vibe I got. That might be unfair. I mean, that sounds mean, but I think there's they can back it up. I mean, with the recent worker strike, which succeeded, they've been able to show success in that department. So the main difference is that both the CWA is more tech workers, apparently, and the IATSE is trying to be more general, more all across the entertainment industry. Basically, the main goal with them that they want to try to achieve would be guaranteeing better healthcare and overtime pay, because you can't really prevent crunch in the current economic system. Like, the current economic system, when it comes to crunch, incentivizes adding the most stuff to your thing, whether it be a movie or a TV show, whatever, as possible, so that it's easier to market and good. As in, like, getting the most work on polishing and fixing up your game or TV or media property. There's an incentive to potentially overwork yourself, because sometimes just if you don't get something done, then it won't show up, and that's going to affect how the game is received and how people are going to enjoy it and how it's going to affect your business, because it's a financial incentive that affects you, at least indirectly, because people do work at studios there are people in the studios that do work there for longer periods of time. Like, it's it's, project to project, but that doesn't mean that people don't only move around studio to studio, that they don't stay in places for a long time. So if a studio struggles to make ends meet, that affects everybody. That affects your bottom line. Like, you as an employee, it affects you. And also just you want to make something you're proud of. And I think it's hard when you create a culture of perfectionism. But also, again, and you see this in Hollywood, like, the conditions in Hollywood are brutal, mostly because of stuff like you need certain daylight hours. Like, you literally can't, it's hard to delay when you can shoot things because you're working with real world time constraints. So grips will often have to work really long hours. And they were like, okay, fine. Well, we're willing to put up with these hours if you actually pay us to make it worth our while. And that's led to a culture and a system where you can make a living, like, even if the hours are brutal. You can be like, okay, 3 months of intense work, and then I don't work for a few for a long time, and I live off the money I made from my overtime pay, and then I can come back to work. So I've read about that, and I imagine that's the kind of world they would want the industry to work under. That kind of flexibility. Now, which I think, given the similarities between movies and games in terms of production, that makes a lot of sense to me. So, the unionization efforts within games are interesting. In fact, let's start this as the summary of GDC overall. Right, this is the overall. My overall thoughts and observations. So the first thing, obviously, the fact that IATSE is even here, and CWA is not surprising. IATSE is interesting, and their booth isn't as prominent as CWA, not as visible, but even just their more quiet presence, it speaks volumes. They don't need to have a big booth to. So it highlights that unionization really is getting it, because the people are having less faith in the publishers to do right by them. Because that's when unions really start taking off. It's when you don't trust the publisher to, or just your company to do what you thought they were going to do for you. And you want to demand more, usually. Which makes sense, because establishing a union, because unions are usually have a bunch of things that, it's just a lot of work, and people don't like adding extra work on themselves unless they have to. I think it's the biggest thing. The second observation is that real-time path tracing is becoming more viable and more common, and it's a huge game changer. Like, it's genuinely a huge, like indirect lighting has always been such a pain in the ass to render, and now we can do a lot with indirect lighting and colored shadows and all sorts of fun properties that we struggle to have access to. So real-time indirect illumination is becoming a thing, which is wild. And it highlights the power of useful machine learning tools like DLSS. The second big thing is that work graphs are big. I didn't see to talk about what work graphs are, and I didn't look them up yet, but I have an idea of what they are. No, that's a lie. But I I heard a snippet of something from one of the talks that said work graphs can execute shaders, can execute other shaders, which is itself pretty big. So work graphs seem to be a huge architectural game changer. Like everybody, all the graphics talks have mentioned like, oh, if we had this, it would improve performance even better, all over the place. From GPU foliage to the path tracing, everybody's been all aflutter over it. The quiet one, I also have noticed, is strides in virtualizing geometry. So there's quite a few examples of like mesh shaders, of people finding new ways to virtualize and make high fidelity meshes more performant. Mesh shaders in particular, I think, are interesting because they represent what seems to be a unification of tessellation and geometry shader stages into something far more flexible and powerful than either of them individually. Which leads directly into the push excuse me, for higher fidelity meshes and building in these higher fidelity meshes into the hardware itself. Like the making it so the hardware by design can process these meshes at better speeds. Another thing I noticed, Unity, because of the Unity controversy, I think, I mean, it really burnt everybody. Everyone's a little burnt, a little skittish about Unity now. They've already either started switching or bargained or whatever. And the result is that it's, I think, put a stain on Unity's image. And you can kind of feel it. Like there was one of the talks, it was a graphics QA, and it laments like not having Unity, or like how Unity's reputation turn has damaged the knowledge that people have, a knowledge base, because now it's going to be less accessible without that engine being as viable. I think, if I remember correctly. Basically expressing that the reputation, the damage that Unity has done to itself could potentially hurt the accessibility of development in some ways. And Unity's presence at GDC is definitely diminished. Like Unity actually has plenty of people who are doing talks and stuff. Like there is a visual effects talk on Tuesday that I already talked about, done by one of the Unity guys that I went to. But their booth is smaller, like compared to Epic's, whose booth is ginormous, and it has way more stuff in it. Unity's is just more quiet and humble by comparison. When Unity last year had the big booth with all the cool stuff in it themselves. So it's a worrying sign for them. I need to start working with Unreal tools anyway, because so many studios use Unreal, and so many studios ask, can you use blueprints, and do you know C++? So working on both I think is going to be a huge asset in the future. But overall, very fun time. I met some cool people. Sven and the Handsome Gentleman dev team were all very fun to hang out with. That Uno session is one of my favorite parts of this year's GDC for me. Inexplicably encountering H-Bomber guy, even for like a brief, actually especially because there is brief, is like one of the most surreal moments of the entire trip. To the point it's almost funny. Like he just looks like, hey, I'm here for fun. Whatever. It just clearly he's looking for someone and then just bounces with one of the double fine, like a senior double fine dev, and I'm just like, oh, that happened. Okay. Just gonna have to move on. So yeah, that was funny. I liked going to the New York booth for a bit. Talking to Cocoon people also was awesome. Learning more about the rendering, about Froxels, about talking to Andrew Cunningham and Toby about RAM. That was very fun for me. It's a personal thing. What a weird... I just realized 2 examples of meeting people's whose YouTube stuff I had seen. Though in the case of Toby and Andrew, that was a more in-depth interaction. Which the moral of the story of that one, to me at least, is that don't be afraid to use assets made by other people. They're very powerful. I mean, RAM's CRT filter is built off of stuff that they found, because they're not really shader people themselves, which is understandable. Shaders can be a bit intimidating. I think that's one of the things that's cool about blueprints. They make shaders less scary and way more accessible. Though they obfuscate how it works under the hood, which can be a problem. But yeah, it was a cool time. Definitely, I think it's different this time too, because I knew people here this time. Like, it wasn't just like, first off, the Seattle Indies people were fucking everywhere. Like, you could throw a stone and hit someone from DigiPen, or hit someone from the Seattle area. Like, we were swarming all over the place like cockroaches. It was kind of awesome. But like the Seattle Indies meetup, like that pre-GDC meetup, that big event was run by us, essentially. So, yeah, huge Seattle presence. And as a result, like, I would see people like Neil, who I worked with the Global Game Jam with, or Alex was there. As I said before. And also people from the IGA, from NJIT, like the Chris's and the Quins. Jira. Sorry. Cough drop. But having people like that there, it made stuff like parties or social events more fun. Though, to be fair, I only went with them to the one party on Monday, but still, just hanging out with them and catching up with them and meeting them in person. It was fun to have those kinds of connections in the area. And I think it makes it way more interesting and thrilling. So yeah, I think this was a very successful GDC. Let's take stock of our final total of business cards. This is a stack. Some of these are more like formalities because I already know some of these people, but this is a stack, I think. You know, that's pretty good, in my opinion. Sakura I kept seeing around quite a few times, which was funny. I didn't say hi really, but she was there. She's been active on LinkedIn, which I have not. That might be something I might do next. I might post a bit about GDC there. But yeah, I'm tired. I think I'm gonna wrap this up. And call it a day. Call it a night. Thank you for watching for watching this video and or any of the other videos. Maybe I'll go next year. Maybe I'll volunteer. That might be something interesting to do. Though that'd be stressful maybe. But yeah. Thank you and have a good night.